Declassified records from 1944 describe a lone predator circling high above the stifling Pacific jungles. Beneath him, Japanese fighters clawed upward, straining to reach the American bombers they were desperate to intercept. None of them realized that a silent hunter was already watching them. This ghost, drifting through the sky, wasn't a hardened killer. He was a quiet kid raised on a Wisconsin farm. By the time the war ended, that same unassuming young man would earn 40 confirmed aerial victories, setting a record of lethal efficiency that remains unmatched. How did one of the least noticeable pilots in the U.S. Army Air Forces transform into its deadliest weapon? This is the story of the pilot no enemy could bring down, the record no one has surpassed, and the harsh reality of what it took to become America's ace of aces. While Bong sharpened his aim, the world around him was igniting. In Europe, the Nazi war machine was crushing entire nations. Across the Pacific, Imperial Japan was advancing with relentless brutality. By 1941, the United States was still a sleeping giant, but the storm of war had already crossed the ocean. Like countless young Americans, Bong felt the pull of duty. He joined the Army Air Corps' Aviation Cadet Program, motivated not by glory, but by a deep, sincere love of flying. His instructors recognized it instantly. He didn't merely operate an aircraft, he blended with it. The controls seemed to respond as if they were extensions of his own body. But raw talent came paired with a dangerous streak, a kind of restless energy. At Hamilton Field in California, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong met the most advanced and arguably the most deadly fighter in America's arsenal, the P-38 Lightning. He fell completely in love with it, and that passion almost destroyed his career before it properly began. The official reports, cleaned up and filed away, describe a set of unauthorized aerobatics. The truth was far more reckless. Bong treated the skies over San Francisco like his personal stunt arena. He flew his P-38 down Market Street at altitudes so low pedestrians could see individual rivets on the wings. He even looped around the Golden Gate Bridge, a spectacular and blatant violation of every regulation in existence. He was showing off, no question, but he was also probing the aircraft's and his own limits. His commanding officer, General George Kenney, had no patience for reckless pilots. A brilliant, tough-minded strategist responsible for the entire 5th Air Force, Kenney was prepared to make an example out of the young lieutenant. When Bong was summoned before him, expecting to be grounded permanently, he stood braced for the worst. The reprimand he received was ferocious, enough to crush a weaker man. But Kenney saw something deeper in Bong's expression. It was not arrogance, it was certainty, total instinctive command of his machine. He recognized the same raw brilliance Bong's instructors had seen. The boy was a prodigy. Kenney, one of the sharpest minds of the war, made a decision that would reshape the air campaign in the Pacific. Instead of ending Bong's career, he would mold him into a weapon. He kept the young pilot under his personal supervision, put him through even more rigorous training, and then released him into combat. By September 1942, Bong was deployed to New Guinea, the brutal front line of the Pacific War. It was a vicious, unforgiving theater where American forces were struggling to stop Japan's southern advance. The opponents Bong would face were not inexperienced recruits. They were seasoned, hardened fighters who had been battling since 1937. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M-0, a legendary aircraft famed for its agility, so maneuverable that it could outturn almost every Allied fighter. On paper, a farm kid with limited combat time should have stood no chance. But Bong wasn't flying an ordinary plane. He was at the controls of the P-38 Lightning, a revolutionary fighter designed by Clarence Jackson of Lockheed. The Lightning was unlike anything else in the sky. Its distinctive twin-boom frame and twin Allison engines gave it blistering speed and unmatched climb capability. And its firepower, all 4.5 caliber machine guns and the 20 mm cannon, was mounted in the nose. This detail was crucial. Wing-mounted guns had to be angled to converge at a set distance, meaning a pilot could easily miss if he fired too early or too late. The P-38, however, fired in a perfectly straight, concentrated stream. If a pilot put an enemy plane in his sights even for an instant, the result was catastrophic. Yet the Lightning was also deadly to its own pilots. The complex turbo superchargers were notoriously finicky, and in steep dives, the aircraft encountered a terrifying aerodynamic issue called compressibility, which locked up the controls and sent pilots plummeting into inescapable dives. Many American aviators had already died simply trying to master the aircraft. The Japanese aces knew the American playbook well. Their tactic was simple: pull the enemy into a slow-speed turning fight. In that type of engagement, the Zero had absolute supremacy. Any U.S. pilot who tried to outturn a Zero usually died within seconds. Richard Bong refused to play their game. On his first missions over Buna, he watched the Zero pilots, studied their movements, and understood exactly what he had to do. If he tried to fight them on their terms, he would not survive. So he created his own strategy. His doctrine was brutally clear. Use the P-38's power to climb high above the enemy. Always hold the altitude advantage. Convert altitude into speed. Dive at the enemy at maximum velocity. Fire one precise, controlled burst with the nose-mounted guns. Use the momentum of the dive to climb back to safety. Never turn, never linger. Hit hard and disappear. His mission reports reflected his personality: calm, restrained, and ruthlessly efficient. He noted conditions, altitude, and results. What the paperwork didn't show was the brilliance unfolding in the sky. Other pilots tended to fire long, desperate bursts, hoping something would connect. Bong did not. Intelligence officers who later reviewed his gun camera footage saw a pattern that was almost unnerving: patient stalking, deliberate positioning, a short, brutal burst of fire, and an immediate breakaway. His squadron mates could hardly believe it. Major Thomas Lynch, himself a decorated ace, compared Bong's flying to the work of a surgeon. He was patient, precise, and wasted nothing. His use of ammunition was extraordinarily efficient. The secret lay in his instinctive mastery of deflection shooting, the skill of aiming not at where the target is now, but where it will be when the bullets arrive. Most pilots struggled with that for their entire careers. For Bong, it seemed as effortless as breathing. His tally began to climb steadily. A single kill on one mission, 2 on another. A bomber here, a 0 there. In the sky, he resembled a quiet phantom, appearing from nowhere, striking with deadly accuracy, and then disappearing back into the glare of the sun. Japanese analysts, examining their escalating losses, began to see a pattern emerge: ferocious, high-speed attacks from above by a twin-tailed fighter. They gave the P-38 a chilling nickname: the Fork-Tailed Devil. And Richard Bong was its most feared master. On the nose of his own P-38, he painted the name of his girlfriend back home, Marge. That aircraft became a legend in the Pacific, an omen of death to Japanese pilots and a sign of salvation to the bomber crews it escorted. By early 1943, Bong had officially become an ace. By year's end, his score was rising at an astonishing pace, and the quiet farm boy was turning into a living legend. In July 1943, over the port of Lae, New Guinea, the air above the battlefield was thick with smoke and tension. A large formation of Japanese bombers, flanked by a swarm of Zero escorts, roared toward Allied positions. To the soldiers crouched in their foxholes, it looked like an unstoppable wave of destruction. Far above them, hidden in the blinding sunlight, Bong and his squadron were climbing into position. The battle that followed would become a classic example of his evolving brilliance. He was no longer just a solitary hunter, he was orchestrating the entire engagement. Rather than diving straight into the enemy, he kept his flight at a superior altitude, forcing Japanese pilots to squint upward into blinding light. He waited with icy patience for the formation to commit fully to its bombing run. He studied their movement, watching for the exact moment when a bomber exposed its underside or when a Zero drifted out of place. Only then did he give the command to attack. The P-38s dropped out of the sky like silver predators. Bong led the dive, his fighter a streak of speed and intent. He ignored the nimble Zeros and went straight for the bombers, the core of the Japanese strike. One short, perfectly aimed burst from his nose guns, and a Mitsubishi bomber erupted in flame and black smoke, disintegrating in midair. He did not pause to admire the kill. He was already pulling up, trading speed for altitude again, scanning for another target. His squadron followed his pattern: attack, break, climb, and re-engage from a new angle. Their hit-and-run tactics sowed confusion among the Japanese pilots, who struggled to track the faster, more powerful American fighters. The outcome was devastating. Numerous enemy aircraft were shot down for minimal Allied losses. Japanese reports from this time describe a growing sense of fear and frustration, recounting encounters with American fighters that struck with alarming speed and clinical precision. The Japanese pilots knew they were being hunted by professionals. By November 1943, Richard Bong had 21 confirmed kills. That number was not just impressive, it was historic. He had become one of America's leading aces, a figure of hope in a war desperate for heroes. General Kenny, ever the strategist, understood the importance of such a symbol. He personally pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on Bong. Then he did something Bong despised. He ordered him home. Bong was recalled to the United States for a war bond tour. The quiet flyer who preferred to let his actions speak was suddenly thrust into fame. He was marched in front of enthusiastic crowds, his photographs splashed across newspapers from New York to California. The American public adored him. He became the storybook figure, a modest farm boy who had turned into a slayer of dragons, an embodiment of American courage and ingenuity. But Bong hated the role. He loathed the ceremonies, the scripted speeches, the endless hands he was expected to shake. In his letters to Marge, he admitted that his heart had never left the Pacific. His friends were still flying and dying while he stood on stages. He felt like a fake, a showpiece, while his fellow pilots remained in mortal danger. He bombarded General Kenny with requests, practically begging to return to combat. Eventually, Kenny relented. By March 1944, Bong was back in New Guinea, and this time something new awaited him. He was issued an upgraded P-38J Lightning. It was a more refined killing instrument. Improved engines, better cockpit heating for high-altitude missions, and, most significantly, hydraulically boosted ailerons. These boosted controls gave the P-38 much better maneuverability at high speeds, addressing one of its earlier shortcomings. In Bong's hands, the P-38J was more than merely a fighter, it was a surgical tool. He returned, however, to a transformed war. Years of grinding conflict had ravaged the Japanese air forces. Many of their seasoned pilots were gone, replaced by young men with minimal training and limited flight hours. The difference in experience between the two sides had grown immense. For an American ace like Bong with hundreds of combat hours, facing these inexperienced pilots was often, tragically, like a hawk attacking sparrows. His tactics continued to evolve. He perfected the head-on pass, a move demanding extraordinary nerve. Most pilots veered away early, terrified of colliding in midair. Bong did not. He kept flying straight toward his opponent, eyes locked on the target, firing until the final possible instant. In those attacks, the closing speeds exceeded 800 miles per hour. The window of opportunity for a kill was less than a second. Gun camera film shows him again and again flying straight through the debris of the aircraft he had just destroyed. In June 1944, the expected milestone finally arrived. On a mission over New Guinea, Bong shot down his 27th and 28th enemy planes. In doing so, he broke the long-standing World War I record of Eddie Rickenbacker, who had 26 confirmed victories. Richard Ira Bong was now officially the greatest living American fighter ace. General Kenny felt enormous pride and deep anxiety. He immediately barred Bong from routine combat flights, declaring that the ace was too important to risk. Bong, he argued, was a national asset. Losing him would be a devastating psychological blow. Bong was livid. Grounded and restless, he insisted that his duty was in the air, leading other pilots in battle. A compromise finally was reached. Kenny allowed him to fly only the most important missions, and only as a formation leader who would direct the fight rather than simply mix into it. He became, in effect, a general in the sky. The new restrictions did not slow him at all. If anything, flying only priority missions meant he was sent precisely where the danger was greatest. Flying only the most critical missions often meant Bong was sent straight into the fiercest battles. In October 1944, over Balikpapan, Borneo, he led a vital mission escorting B-24 bombers attacking Japanese oil refineries. The Japanese understood exactly how important those targets were and hurled everything they had at the incoming formation in a last-ditch effort to protect their fuel. The sky exploded into a chaotic swirl of dogfights. Bong, at the head of his P-38s, positioned his formation with the sun behind them, a classic trick to blind the enemy. He led the opening strike, diving from above and blasting an opposing fighter out of the air. But as he pulled out of his attack, his own aircraft suddenly shuddered under a violent impact. A Japanese fighter had slipped behind him. Cannon shells tore into his right engine. Warning lights flared across his instrument panel. The engine coughed, caught fire, and died. Most pilots in that situation would have broken off immediately, diving for home on the remaining engine. That would have been the sensible choice. That would have been the safe choice. Richard Bong did neither. In that moment, he was not thinking like a cautious pilot. He was thinking like a hunter. He feathered the dead propeller to cut drag, triggered the fire extinguisher system, and took stock of his options with icy calm. The aircraft was still flyable. His guns still worked, and there were still enemy fighters in the sky. With his P-38 damaged and trailing smoke, he turned back toward the melee. Flying on one engine, with his performance drastically reduced, he re-entered the fight, tracked down another Japanese aircraft, and shot it down. Only after claiming that second kill did he head for home, coaxing the wounded fighter over hundreds of miles of open ocean. When he landed, the maintenance crews were stunned. The P-38 was full of holes, the right engine completely destroyed. They wrote the aircraft off as no longer suitable for combat and earmarked it for scrapping. They did not account for the connection between Bong and his airplane. He personally supervised the repairs, refusing to give up on the machine that had carried him through so many missions. Within a few weeks, he was back in the cockpit of Marge. That single episode locked his legend into place. He was not merely skilled, he was fearless. He was not just an ace, he seemed practically indestructible. After that mission, his score continued its relentless climb toward numbers no one had imagined possible: 35, 36, 38. By December 1944, he had reached 40 confirmed kills. The figure was almost unbelievable. It was so far beyond normal combat experience that it felt less like a statistic and more like a myth. Back in the United States, the highest levels of command made a final decision. General Douglas MacArthur himself sent an order to General Kenney. This time, it was not a suggestion. Richard Bong was to be grounded permanently. His fighting days were finished. He was simply too important as a symbol to risk losing. America's ace of aces was going home for good, whether he agreed with it or not. His last combat sortie took place on December 17, 1944. It was a quiet patrol with no enemy contact. Just like that, without any dramatic final battle, the combat career of the most successful fighter pilot in U.S. history came to an end. He returned to America not to the peaceful farm life he dreamed of, but to a country exhausted by war and eager to celebrate its heroes. Richard Bong had become more than just a flyer. He was a symbol of hope, a living embodiment of the quiet, steady determination that would eventually win the war. He received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for bravery. In the solemn halls of the Pentagon, Secretary of War Stimson placed the medal around his neck as the official citation was read. The language was formal and restrained, but the deeds it described bordered on unbelievable. It spoke of his extraordinary bravery and willingness to risk his life far beyond what duty required. It cited his unwavering courage, his exceptional leadership, and his relentless attacks against the enemy, even when heavily outnumbered and under intense fire. Bong stood there in typical fashion, reserved, modest, and slightly ill at ease in a uniform covered in medals. He was a man who expressed himself in action, not in speeches. He felt far more comfortable strapped into a P-38 at 20,000 feet than surrounded by politicians and generals. After the ceremonies, he finally had a moment that belonged only to him. On February 10, 1945, he married his longtime sweetheart, Marjorie Vandendahl, in a church in Superior, Wisconsin. For a brief time, the deadliest ace in American history was just a husband, a young man hoping to build a quiet life far from screaming engines and exploding shells. In Europe, the war was entering its final bloody phase. For the first time, the end of the global conflict seemed truly close. But what had really made his achievements possible? How had one man, in one specific aircraft, produced a record that looks almost impossible on paper? The solution lay in a blend of factors: the man himself, the machine he flew, and a combat doctrine years ahead of its era. After the war, Army Air Force's analysts combed through his gun camera films. What they saw stunned them. Bong's accuracy, the proportion of rounds fired that actually translated into kills, was extraordinarily high, far above typical levels. He did not waste ammunition. He did not depend on luck. He relied instead on a cool, mathematical understanding of speed, angles, and timing that seemed wired into his brain. His upbringing as a hunter, quietly stalking game through the woods, had trained him to think in terms of lead, deflection, and that one perfect shot. Over roughly 200 combat missions, he refined a tactical approach that became the benchmark for American fighter pilots in the Pacific. His system was built on discipline rather than reckless aggression. While many others got sucked into tight-turning, close-in dogfights, the sort of romantic duels popular in films, Bong knew that going nose-to-nose with the agile Zero was a quick route to death. His method was ruthless in its logic. First came energy, always maintain the advantage of speed and altitude. Bong's foundational rule was to always maintain an energy advantage by staying higher and faster than his opponent. The P-38 excelled as a high-altitude interceptor, and Bong used this trait to control the rhythm of every engagement. His second principle was positioning. He used the sun, cloud cover, and even the enemy's own formation patterns to maneuver into the ideal attack point before ever squeezing the trigger. He had the patience of a hunter, sometimes spending long stretches quietly adjusting his position until the angle was perfect. His third principle was firepower. The P-38's clustered nose-mounted guns gave him a brutally efficient advantage. If he could bring those weapons to bear for even the briefest instant, the fight was essentially decided. His fourth rule was unwavering discipline. He refused to get into turning dogfights with the Zero. After every attack pass, he would use his superior speed to climb away, regain altitude, and prepare for another strike on his own terms. Bong fought a vertical battle defined by physics and energy, while his adversaries remained tied to horizontal turning fights. And then there was the machine itself. The P-38 Lightning was perfectly suited to the style of combat Bong mastered. Its twin engines provided a vital safety margin, letting the aircraft endure tremendous damage and still return its pilot home, as Bong famously demonstrated over Borneo. Its tricycle landing gear made it reliable on the rough, improvised airstrips scattered across the Pacific, and its turbo superchargers allowed it to operate where many Japanese fighters simply could not compete. In the hands of an ordinary pilot, the Lightning was a strong platform. In the hands of Richard Bong, it became a historically significant weapon. Letters he wrote to Marge revealed the quieter man behind the legend. He rarely talked about the victories that made him famous. Instead, he wrote about responsibility, protecting bomber formations, supporting ground troops, and doing his job well. He never saw himself as a glory-hungry ace. He saw himself as a guardian for the men who depended on him. There was no swagger, no theatrics, only the focused, deadly competence of a craftsman devoted to precision. As the year 1945 began, Bong's life was supposed to shift into security and national prestige. He had become a hero, a husband, and a living emblem of American success. But the warrior inside him couldn't stay grounded for long. The military, wanting to harness his unmatched experience, assigned him a new role: test pilot. Aviation was undergoing a dramatic transformation. The piston engines that had ruled the skies for 4 decades were about to be replaced by a terrifyingly powerful newcomer, the jet engine. At Lockheed's highly secretive Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California, Kelly Johnson, the same visionary who created the P-38, had designed America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. This sleek new aircraft, driven by a single jet engine producing 4,000 pounds of thrust, could break past 500 miles per hour. It represented an entirely new era, faster, more complex, and far more dangerous. The Army Air Forces needed its most capable pilots to master this new weapon and create the doctrine that would guide jet combat for the future. Richard Bong, the undisputed master of piston engine fighters, was chosen to help usher in the jet age. He stood at a technological crossroads, leaving behind the peak of one generation and stepping into the birth of another. Once again he was operating on the cutting edge, but now the threat wasn't a Zero in his sights. It was the unknown itself. Testing the P-80 put Bong in the middle of a revolution. The aircraft was nothing like the Lightning he had dominated the skies with. The P-80 had no propeller, no torque, only the raw, shrieking force of a jet engine. It behaved in every way. Its landing speeds were unnervingly high, its climb performance shocking, and every pilot who transitioned to jets understood they were entering territory no one had fully charted. In many respects, they were explorers risking their lives to define what jet aviation would become. With his mechanical intuition and natural feel for aircraft, Bong adapted quickly. He approached the P-80 with the same disciplined curiosity he once applied to tactics. He wasn't fighting enemies now. He was pushing a machine to its limits, gathering data, and relaying critical insights to the engineers building the future of flight. For several months, this became his routine: flight logs, technical debriefs, and the constant shrill of a jet turbine. Then came August 6, 1945, a bright, hot California day at the Lockheed Air Terminal in Burbank. For Major Richard Bong, it was supposed to be just another ordinary test flight. He was scheduled to take a routine acceptance flight in a newly built P-80, fresh from the production line. After completing his pre-flight inspection, he suited up, climbed into the cockpit of the sleek new jet, and let the canopy slide shut around him. The engine spooled up with its high-pitched wail, and Bong taxied out to the runway. Once cleared for takeoff, he advanced the throttle. The jet surged forward with incredible force, pressing him into the seat as it lifted smoothly into the California sky. But only seconds after becoming airborne, something went terribly wrong. A main fuel pump failed. The engine, starved of fuel, flamed out completely. Beneath him stretched the vast suburbs of Los Angeles. He was far too low for comfort and sitting in an aircraft that, without power, dropped from the sky like a stone. For the man who had survived 200 combat missions, who had fought his way through swarms of enemy fighters, who had once coaxed a damaged P-38 home on a single burning engine, this became his final and most hopeless fight. It was a struggle against physics, gravity, and the merciless passage of seconds. Instinct and training took over. He attempted to restart the engine, but he simply didn't have the altitude. He tried to glide the powerless jet toward the runway, but it was impossible. In the final brief moments of his life, with the ground rising rapidly toward him, he made one last attempt to save himself. He tried to bail out, but he was too low. There wasn't enough time. The P-80 slammed into a field and erupted in flames. Major Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, the Wisconsin farm kid who became the deadliest fighter pilot in United States history, was killed instantly. He was just 24 years old. And on that very same day, on the opposite side of the world, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay released a strange new weapon over the city of Hiroshima. In a searing flash, the bomb obliterated the city and revealed the terrifying power of atomic destruction. The world had entered a new age. The news of Richard Bong's death, America's greatest aviation hero, was almost lost amid the overwhelming global headlines announcing the dawn of nuclear warfare. In a cruel and symbolic twist of fate, the master of traditional aerial combat died on the very day that his kind of warfare was made obsolete. 80 years later, Bong's record of 40 confirmed kills still stands unbroken, and almost certainly always will. Modern air combat, conducted through radar, sensors, and missiles fired at distant, invisible targets, will never again mirror the close-range, high-stakes dogfights of the Second World War. The age of the gunslinging ace is gone forever, yet Bong's true legacy wasn't measured only by the 40 enemy aircraft he destroyed. It lived in the bomber crews he protected, the infantrymen who trusted him to own the skies, and the tactical doctrine he pioneered that saved the lives of countless American pilots. His methods became the blueprint for U.S. aerial combat for many years. General George Kenney, the commander who recognized the genius beneath the reckless young rule-breaker, would later write that Bong was the greatest fighter pilot he had ever seen. Kenney believed Bong's dominance came not from aggression, but from something far more rare: cool, meticulous precision. He made the act of killing seem effortless because everything he did was built on repeatable, disciplined principles. The P-38, the fighter plane he flew to his legend, is now a silent monument to the man who flew it into legend. 40 confirmed victories, 200 missions, a tactical doctrine that reshaped American air combat, and above all, a legend that has never been matched. Richard Ira Bong, the farm kid from Wisconsin, who became the most lethal and untouchable fighter ace in American history, remains, even now, the benchmark against which all other pilots are measured. His story endures not because of the numbers he achieved, but because of the man he was: humble, disciplined, fearless, and devastatingly effective. The ace of aces, the protector of bomber crews, the pioneer of a new tactical philosophy, the quiet young man who changed aerial warfare forever.